Hey, I'm Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. We are continuing Slaughterhouse 5 on Chapter 6. Listen, Billy Pilgrim says he went to Dresden, Germany on the day after his morphine night in the British compound in the center of the extermination camp for Russian prisoners of war. Billy woke up at dawn on that day in January. There were no windows in the little hospital, and the ghostly candles had gone out. So the only light came from pinprick holes in the walls and from a sketchy rectangle outlined the imperfectly fitted door. Little Paul Lazaro, with a broken arm, snored on one bed. Edgar Derby, the high school teacher who would eventually be shot, snored on another. Billy sat up in bed. He had no idea what year it was or what planet he was on. Whatever the planet's name was, it was cold. But it wasn't the cold that had awakened Billy. It was animal magnetism which was making him shiver and itch. It gave him profound aches in his musculature, as though he had been exercising hard. The animal magnetism was coming from behind him. If Billy had to guess as to the source, he would have said that there was a vampire bat hanging upside down on the wall behind him. Billy moved down toward the foot of his cot before turning to look at whatever it was. He didn't want the animal to drop into his face and maybe claw his eyes out or bite off his big nose. Then he turned. The source of the magnetism really did resemble a bat. It was Billy's impresario's coat with the fur collar. It was hanging from a nail. Billy now backed toward it again, looking at it over his shoulder, feeling the magnetism increase. Then he faced it, kneeling on his cot, dared to touch it here and there. He was seeking the exact source of the radiations. He found two small sources, two lumps an inch apart and hidden in the lining. One was shaped like a pea, the other was shaped like a tiny horseshoe. Billy received a message carried by the radiations. He was told not to find out what the lumps were. He was advised to be content with knowing that they could work miracles for him, provided he did not insist on learning their nature. That was all right with Billy Pilgrim. He was grateful. He was glad. Billy dozed, awakened in the prison hospital again. The sun was high. Outside were Golgotha sounds of strong men digging holes in upright timbers and hard ground. Englishmen were building themselves a new latrine. They had abandoned their old latrine to the Americans, and their theater, the place where the feast had been held, too. 6 Englishmen staggered through the hospital with a pool table on which several mattresses were piled. They were transferring it to living quarters attached to the hospital. They were followed by an Englishman dragging his mattress and carrying a dartboard. The man with the dartboard was the blue fairy godmother who had injured little Paul Lazaro. He stopped by Lazaro's bed and asked Lazaro how he was. Lazaro told him he was going to have him killed after the war. "Oh, you made a big mistake. Anybody touches me, he better kill me, or I'm going to have him killed." The blue fairy godmother knew something about killing. He gave Lazaro a careful smile. "There is still time for me to kill you," he said. "If you really persuade me, that's the sensible thing to do." "Why don't you go fuck yourself?" "I don't think I haven't tried," the blue fairy godmother answered. The blue fairy godmother laughed, amused and patronizing. When he was gone, Lazaro promised Billy and poor old Edgar Derby that he was going to have revenge, and that revenge was sweet. "It's the sweetest thing there is," said Lazaro. "People fuck with me," he said, "and Jesus Christ, are they ever fucking sorry. I laugh like hell. I don't care if it's a guy or a dame. If the President of the United States fucked around with me, I'd fix him good. You should have seen what I did to a dog one time." "A dog?" said Billy. "Son of a bitch bit me, So I got some steak, and I got me the spring out of a clock, and I cut that spring up in little pieces. I put points on the ends of the pieces. They were sharp as razor blades. I stuck them into the steak way inside, and I went past where they had the dogs tied up. He wanted to bite me again. I said to him, "Come on, doggy, let's be friends. Let's not be enemies anymore. I'm not mad." He believed me. He did? I threw him the steak. He swallowed it down in one big gulp. I waited around for 10 minutes. Now Lazzaro's eyes twinkled. Blood started coming out of his mouth. He started crying, and he rolled on the ground as though the knives were outside of him instead of inside of him. Then he tried to bite out his own insides. I laughed, and I said to him, "You got the right idea now. Tear out your guts out, boy. That's me in there with all those knives." So it goes. "Anybody ever ask you what the sweetest thing in life is?" said Lazzaro. "It's revenge." When Dresden was destroyed later on, incidentally, Lazzaro did not exult. He didn't have anything against the Germans, he said. Also, he said he liked to take his enemies one at a time. He was proud of never having hurt an innocent bystander. Nobody ever got it from Lazzaro, he said, who didn't have it coming. Poor old Edgar Derby, the high school teacher, got into the conversation now. He asked Lazzaro if he planned to feed the blue fairy godmother clock springs and steak. "Shit," said Lazzaro. "He's a pretty big man," said Derby, who of course was pretty big man himself. "Size don't mean a thing." "Oh, you're going to shoot him?" "I'm going to have him shot," said Lazzaro. "He'll get home after the war. He'll be a big hero. The dames will be climbing all over him. He'll settle down. A couple of years will go by, and then one day there'll be a knock on his door. He opened the door, and there'll be a stranger out there. The stranger will ask him if he's so-and-so. When he says he is, the stranger will say, 'Paul Lazzaro sent me,' and he'll pull out a gun and shoot his pecker off. The stranger will let him think a couple of seconds about who Paul Lazzaro is, and then what life's going to be like without a pecker. And then he'll shoot him once in the guts and walk away. So it goes." Lazzaro said that he could have anybody in the world killed for $1,000 plus traveling expenses. He had a list in his head, he said. Derby asked him who all was on the list, and Lazzaro said, "Just make fucking sure you don't get on it. Don't cross me, that's all." There was a silence, and then he added, "And don't cross my friends." "You have friends?" Derby wanted to know. "In the war?" said Lazzaro. "Yeah, I had a friend in the war. He's dead." So it goes. "That's too bad." Lazzaro's eyes were twinkling again. "Yeah, he was my buddy on the boxcar. His name was Roland Weary. He died in my arms." Now he pointed to Billy with his one mobile hand. "He died on account of this silly cocksucker right here, so I promised him I'd have this silly cocksucker shot after the war." Lazzaro erased with his hand anything Billy Pilgrim might be about to say. "Just forget about it, kid," he said. "Enjoy life while you can. Nothing's going to happen for maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But let me give you a piece of advice. Whenever the doorbell rings, have someone else answer the door." Billy Pilgrim says now that this really is the way he is going to die, too. As a time traveler, he has seen his own death many times, has described it to a tape recorder. The tape is locked up with his will and some other valuables in his safe deposit box at Ilium Merchants National Bank and Trust, he says. "I, Billy Pilgrim," the tape begins, "will die, have died, and always will die on February 13th, 1976. At the time of his death, he says, he's in Chicago to address a large crowd on the subject of flying saucers and the true nature of time. His home is still in Ilium. He has had to cross 3 international boundaries in order to reach Chicago. The United States of America has been balkanized, has been divided into 20 petty nations so that it will never again be a threat to world peace. Chicago has been hydrogen bombed by angry Chinamen, so it goes. It's all brand new. Billy is speaking before a capacity audience in a baseball park which is covered by a geodesic dome. The flag of the country is behind him. It is a Hereford bowl on a field of green. Billy predicts his own death within an hour. He laughs about it, invites the crowd to laugh with him. "It is high time I was dead," he said. "Many years ago," he said, "a certain man promised to have me killed. He's an old man now, living not far from here. He has read all the publicity associated with my appearance in your fair city. He is insane, and tonight he will keep his promise." There were protests from the crowd. Billy Pilgrim rebukes them. "If you protest, you think that death is a terrible thing. Then you have not understood a word I've said." Now he closes his speech, as he closes every speech, with these words: "Farewell, hello, farewell, hello." There are police around him as he leaves the stage. They are there to protect him from the crush of popularity. No threats on his life have been made since 1945. The police offer to stay with him. They are floridly willing to stand in a circle around him all night with their zap guns drawn. "No, no," says Billy serenely. "It is time for you to go home to your wives and children, and it is time for me to be dead for a little while and then live again." At that moment, Billy's high forehead is in the crosshairs of a high-powered laser gun. It is aimed at him from the darkened press box, and the next moment Billy Pilgrim is dead. So it goes. So Billy experiences death for a while. It is simply violet light and a hum. There isn't anybody else there. Not even Billy Pilgrim is there. Then he swings back into life again, all the way back to an hour after his life was threatened by Lazaro in 1945. He's been told to get out of his hospital bed and dress, that he is well. He and Lazaro and poor old Edgar Derby are to join their fellows in the theater. There they'll choose a leader for themselves by secret ballot in a free election. Billy and Lazaro and poor old Edgar Derby cross the prison yard to the theater now. Billy was carrying his little coat as though it were a lady's muff. It was wrapped around and around his hands. He was the central clown in an unconscious travesty, that famous oil painting, The Spirit of 76. Edgar Derby was writing letters home in his head, telling his wife that he was alive and well, that she shouldn't worry, that the war was nearly over, and that he would soon be home. Lazaro was talking to himself about people he was going to have killed after the war, and rackets he was going to work, and women he was going to make fuck him, whether they wanted to or not. If he had been a dog in a city, a policeman would have shot him and sent his head to a laboratory to see if he had rabies. So it goes. As they neared the theater, they came upon an Englishman who was hacking a groove in the earth with the heel of his boot. He was marking a boundary between the American and English sections of the compound. Billy and Lazaro and Derby didn't have to ask what the line meant. It was a familiar symbol from childhood. The theater was paved with American bodies that nestled like spoons. Most of the Americans were in stupors or asleep. Their guts were fluttering, dryly. "Close the fucking door," somebody said to Billy. "Were you born in a barn?" Billy closed it, took a hand from his muff, touched the stove. It was as cold as ice. The stage was still set for Cinderella. Azure curtains hung from arches which were shocking pink. There were golden thrones and the dummy clock whose hands were set at midnight. Cinderella's slippers, which were airmen's boots painted silver, were capsized side by side under a golden throne. Billy and poor old Edgar Derby and Lazaro had been in the hospital when the British had passed out the blankets and mattresses, so they had none. They had to improvise. The only space open to them was up on the stage, and they went up there and pulled the azure curtains down and made nests. Billy, curled in his azure nest, found himself staring at Cinderella's silver boots under a throne, and then he remembered that his shoes were ruined, that he needed boots. He hated to get out of his nest, but forced himself to do it. He crawled to the boots on all fours, sat, and tried them on. The boots fit perfectly. Billy Pilgrim was Cinderella, and Cinderella was Billy Pilgrim. Somewhere in there was a lecture on personal hygiene by the head Englishman, and then a free election. At least half of the Americans went on snoozing through it all. The Englishman got up on the stage, and he rapped on the arm of a throne with his swagger stick, called, "Lads, lads, lads, can I have your attention, please?" and so on. What the Englishman said about survival was this: "If you stop taking pride in your appearance, you will very soon die." He said that he had seen several men die in the following way. They ceased to stand up straight, then ceased to shave or wash, then ceased to get out of bed, then ceased to talk, then died. There is this much to be said for it. It is evidently a very easy and painless way to go. So it goes. The Englishman said that when he captured, had made and kept the following vows to himself: to brush his teeth twice a day, to shave once a day, to wash his face and hands before every meal and after going to the latrine, to polish his shoes once a day, and to exercise for at least half an hour each morning, and then move his bowels, and then to look into a mirror frequently, frankly evaluating his appearance, particularly with respect to posture. Billy Pilgrim heard all this while lying in his nest. He looked over, not at the Englishman's face, but at his ankles. "I envy you, lads," said the Englishman. Somebody laughed. Billy wondered what the joke was. "You lads are leaving this afternoon for Dresden, a beautiful city, I'm told. You won't be cooped up like us. You'll be out where the life is, where the food is certain to be more plentiful than here. If I may inject a personal note, it has been 5 years now since I've seen a tree or flower or woman or child, or a dog or a cat or a place of entertainment, or a human being doing useful work of any kind. You needn't worry about bombs, by the way. Dresden is an open city. It is undefended and contains no war industries or troop concentrations of any importance." Somewhere in there, old Edgar Derby was elected head American. The Englishman called for his nomination from the floor, and there weren't any. So he nominated Derby, praised him for his maturity and long experience in dealing with people. There were no further nominations, and the nominations were closed. "All in favor?" 2 or 3 people said aye. Then poor old Derby made a speech. He thanked the Englishman for his good advice, and he meant to follow it exactly. He said he was sure that all the other Americans would do the same. He said that his primary responsibility now was to make damn well sure everybody got home safely. "Go take a flying fuck at a rolling donut," murmured Paul Lazaro in his azure nest. "Go take a flying fuck at the moon." The temperature climbed startlingly that day. Noontime was balmy. The Germans brought soup and bread in 2-wheeled carts which were pulled by Russians. The Englishmen sent over real coffee and sugar and marmalade and cigarettes and cigars, and the doors of the theater were left open so warmth could get in. Americans began to feel much better. They were able to hold their food, and then it was time to go to Dresden. The Americans marched fairly stylishly out of the British compound. Billy Pilgrim again led the parade. He had silver boots now, and a muff, and a piece of azure curtain which he wore like a toga. Billy still had a beard. So did poor old Edgar Derby, who was beside him. Derby was imagining letters to home, his lips working tremulously. "Dear Margaret, we are leaving for Dresden today. Don't worry. It will never be bombed. It is an open city. There was an election at noon, and guess what?" And so on. They came to the prison railroad yard again. They had arrived on only 2 cars. They would depart far more comfortably on 4. They saw the dead hobo again. He was frozen stiff in the weeds beside the track. He was in a fetal position, trying even in death to nestle like a spoon with the others. There were no others now. He was nestling with thin air and cinders. Somebody had taken his boots. His bare feet were blue and ivory. It was all right somehow, his being dead. So it goes. A trip to Dresden was a lark. It took only 2 hours. Shriveled little bellies were full. Sunlight and mild air came in through the ventilators. There were plenty of smokes from the Englishmen. The Americans arrived in Dresden at 5 in the afternoon. The boxcar doors were opened, and the doorways framed the loveliest city that most of the Americans had ever seen. The skyline was intricate and voluptuous and enchanted and absurd. It looked like a Sunday school picture of heaven to Billy Pilgrim. Somebody behind him in the boxcar said, "Oz." That was I. That was me. The only other city I'd ever seen was Indianapolis, Indiana. Every other big city in Germany had been bombed and burned ferociously. Dresden had not suffered so much as a cracked window pane. Sirens went off every day, screamed like hell, and people went down into cellars and listened to radios there. The planes were always bound for someplace else. Leipzig, Chemnitz, Plauen, place like that. So it goes. Steam radiator still whistled cheerily in Dresden. Streetcars changed. Telephones rang and were answered. Lights went on and off when switches were clicked. There were theaters and restaurants. There was a zoo. The principal enterprises of the city were medicine and food processing and the making of cigarettes. People were going home from work now in the late afternoon, and they were tired. 8 Dresdeners crossed the steel spaghetti of the railroad yard. They were wearing new uniforms. They had been sworn into the army the day before. They were boys and men past middle age, and 2 veterans who had been shot to pieces in Russia. Their assignment was to guard 100 American prisoners of war who would work as contract labor. A grandfather and his grandson were in the squad. The grandfather was an architect. The 8 were grim as they approached the boxcars containing their wards. They knew what sick and foolish soldiers they themselves appeared to be. One of them actually had an artificial leg and carried not only a loaded rifle but a cane. Still, they were expected to earn obedience and respect from tall, cocky, murderous American infantrymen who had just come from all the killing at the front. Then they saw bearded Billy Pilgrim, in his blue toga and silver shoes, with his hands in a muff. He looked at least 60 years old. Next to Billy was little Paul Lazaro with a broken arm. He was fizzing with rabies. Next to Paul Lazaro was poor old high school teacher Edgar Derby, mournfully pregnant with patriotism and middle age and imaginary wisdom, and so on. The 8 ridiculous Dresdeners ascertained that these 100 ridiculous creatures really were American fighting men, fresh from the front. They smiled, and then they laughed. Their terror evaporated. There was nothing to be afraid of. Here were more crippled human beings, more fools like themselves. Here was light opera. So out of the gate of the railroad yard and into the streets of Dresden marched the light opera. Billy Pilgrim was the star. He led the parade. Thousands of people were on the sidewalks going home from work. They were watery, putty-colored, having eaten mostly potatoes during the past 2 years. They had expected no blessings beyond the mildness of the day. Suddenly, here was fun. Billy did not meet many of the eyes that found him so entertaining. He was enchanted by the architecture of the city. Mary Amoretti wove garlands along above the windows. Roguish fawns and naked nymphs peeked down at Billy from festooned cornices. Stone monkeys frisked along scrolls and seashells and bamboo. Billy, with his memories of the future, knew that the city would be smashed to smithereens and then burned in about 30 more days. He knew, too, that most of the people watching him would soon be dead. So it goes. And Billy worked his hands in his muff as he marched, his fingertips working there in the hot darkness of the muff, wanting to know what the two lumps in the lining of his little impresario's coat were. The fingertips got inside the lining. They palpated the lumps, the pea-shaped thing and the horseshoe-shaped thing. The parade had to be halted by a busy corner. The traffic light was red. There at the corner, in the front rank of pedestrians, was a surgeon who had been operating all day. He was a civilian, but his posture was military. He served in 2 world wars. The sight of Billy offended him, especially after he learned from the guards that Billy was an American. It seemed to him that Billy was in an abominable taste. Suppose that Billy had gone to do a lot of silly trouble to costume himself just so. The surgeon spoke English, and he said to Billy, "I take it you find war a very comical thing." Billy looked at him vaguely. Billy had lost track momentarily of where he was or how he had gotten there. He had no idea that people thought he was clowning. It was fate, of course, which had costumed him. Fate and a feeble will to survive. "Did you expect us to laugh?" The surgeon asked him. The surgeon was demanding some sort of satisfaction. Billy was mystified. Billy wanted to be friendly, to help him if he could, but his resources were meager. His fingers now held the 2 objects from the lining of the coat. Billy decided to show the surgeon what they were. "You thought you would enjoy being mocked," the surgeon said. "And do you feel proud to represent America as you do?" Billy withdrew a hand from his muff, held it under the surgeon's nose. On his palm rested a 2-carat diamond and a partial denture. The denture was an obscene little artifact, silver and pearl and tangerine. Billy smiled. The parade pranced, staggered, and reeled to the gate of the Dresden slaughterhouse, and then it went inside. The slaughterhouse wasn't a busy place anymore. Almost all the hooved animals in Germany had been killed and eaten and excreted by human beings, mostly soldiers. So it goes. The Americans were taken to the 5th building inside the gate. It was a 1-story cement block cube with sliding doors in front and back. It had been built as a shelter for pigs about to be butchered. Now it was going to serve as a home away from home for 100 American prisoners of war. There were bunks in there, and 2 pot-bellied stoves and a water tap. Behind it was a latrine, which was a 1-rail fence with buckets under it. There was a big number over the door of the building. The number was 5. Before Americans could go inside, their only English-speaking guard told them to memorize their simple address. In case they got lost in the big city, their address was such as this: Slaughterhouse 5. Slaughterhouse means slaughterhouse. 5 was good old 5. And that's the end of that chapter.